Welcome to The Making of Britain, the story of how land, law and power shaped an island. In each episode we trace a turning point that changed what Britain was and what it would become. I imagine the first time I spoke to Mrs. Jennings about the vote. It was a cold morning in 1832 and we were huddled around the fire in the poorhouse parlour. She was 72 and nearly blind, with fingers bent from decades of laundry work and a voice so soft you had to lean in to hear. "You know," she said, "I've seen 5 kings and never once been asked what I think." That story stays with me because it wasn't just Mrs. Jennings, it was millions of people like her and like me who lived their whole lives under laws they had no say in making. So how did we get here? From a system where only landowners, men with property, could vote, to one where suffrage is nearly universal. And perhaps a better question is, why did anyone ever think that was fair? Let's go back, way back to the 1400s. England's parliament existed, yes, but it was hardly democratic. The right to vote was tied directly to land, not your opinion, not your intelligence, certainly not your humanity, just your acreage. The critical moment came in 1430 with the 40-shilling Freeholder Act. The thinking was clear. Property owners had a stake in the country. They paid taxes. They had responsibilities. Everyone else? Dependent, disorderly, dangerous. So they should be governed, not governing. And to be fair, the fear of instability was real. The memory of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 lingered like a shadow. Give them more power, the elites argued, and the country will burn. But of course, it was never about safety, it was about control. So the question becomes, when did people begin to realise that ownership of land shouldn't mean ownership of the power? By the 1700s, the land-based voting system had become absurd. Picture this: Old Sarum in Wiltshire, a place with no residents, had 2 members of parliament. Meanwhile, industrial Manchester, growing rapidly, had no representation at all. These were the infamous rotten boroughs, political ghost towns kept alive by landowners to retain control in parliament. Votes weren't tied to people, they were tied to property boundaries, however irrelevant. And remember, only about 2% of the population could vote. 2%. In an age of empire, industry and ideas, power remained tightly locked behind estate gates. But resistance was growing. The American and the French revolutions echoed through the streets of Britain. Demands for reform turned violent at times, like at Peterloo in 1819, where cavalry charged a peaceful protest demanding suffrage. So pressure mounted. Reform was no longer a polite request, it was a storm on the horizon. And so in 1832, change came. But what kind of change? Was a Great Reform Act really great at all? Mrs. Jennings lived to see the Great Reform Act passed. She'd heard rumours of democracy, of real power flowing down to ordinary people. But the day the law was read aloud in her village, she only laughed. She wasn't wrong. The 1832 Act did expand the electorate. It wiped out many rotten boroughs and gave seats to growing towns. But it didn't challenge the core idea that voting was for property holders only. It simply adjusted the price tag. Now, middle-class men, those renting property worth £10 a year, could vote. That added about 300,000 voters, bringing the total to just 5% of the adult population. Still no women, still no working-class men, still no poor. But it sparked something, a movement, a belief that the vote wasn't a gift for the rich, but a right for all. And soon people began asking, if £10 renters could vote, why not factory workers? Why not farmers? In the 1830s and 40s, a new wave of protest exploded, Chartism. It was a working class movement demanding 6 key reforms, including universal male suffrage and secret ballots. Imagine Mrs. Jennings listening to young men read out the Chartist charter in the workhouse. Her eyes would have lit up, hopefully wary. She'd lived long enough to know how resists change. The movement was massive, over 3 million signatures gathered on one petition in 1848, but Parliament rejected it again. Still, the pressure didn't fade. Industrialisation created a new class of voters in waiting: clerks, teachers, men without land, but not without opinion. But there were still millions left behind, Mrs. Jennings amongst them. And the next question had already begun to form. If men without land could vote, why not women with none? Mrs. Jennings passed away years before suffrage. She never got to vote, never saw a woman cast a ballot in Britain, never heard a politician say, "Your view matters." But others carried her story. The 20th century brought radical change. After the horrors of World War I, Britain finally extended the vote to some women in 1918, those over 30 who met property requirements. Then, in 1928, the law equalised voting age and status between men and women. From there, it didn't take long for the vote to become near universal. In 1969, the voting age lowered to 18. In 1983, reforms to make voter registration easier. And in the 2000s, expansion of postal and proxy voting. But at each step, the same question reappeared in different clothes. Who gets to stay in power? And perhaps more importantly, who still doesn't? Because today we talk a lot about democracy, but the roots of our system, land, wealth, gatekeeping, still cast shadows. Campaign finance, media ownership, unequal access to information, these are the modern forms of exclusion. So if we want to honour the people like Mrs. Jennings, we have to keep asking, what does a truly fair democracy look like? When I think back to Mrs. Jennings, I don't picture an old workhouse or the cold hearth. I picture her shawl and the way she said, "They never asked me what I thought." That's the heart of it, really. Power isn't about shouting the loudest, it's about who gets asked, who gets listened to. And for centuries in Britain, if you didn't own land, you weren't part of the conversation. But change came slowly and unevenly, through protests and petitions, reforms and reckonings, not handed down, but dragged forward by ordinary people who refused to be silent. Thank you for walking a little further down the road of Britain's past with me. The story winds on in episodes like this. Until then, take care, and I'll see you soon.